When I bought my house, I thought I was stepping into the next chapter of my life, a chapter of independence, stability, and peace. I had worked my way up from practically nothing, taking every overtime shift I could, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and most of my social life to finally reach the point where I could own a place of my own. The house wasn't just four walls. It was a symbol of every drop of sweat I had shed, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice that had gone into making a dream real. It was a modest home. Not a mansion by any means, but it sat in a neat, quiet neighborhood. The streets were lined with identical-looking houses, manicured lawns, and the kind of uniform order that suggested someone or something was always watching. That something was the HOA. I'd heard horror stories about homeowners associations before I moved in, but I told myself that those were exaggerated. Not all HOAs could be that bad. Besides, I was careful with money, paid bills on time, and didn't go out of my way to cause trouble. I thought if I kept to myself and followed the rules, I'd be fine. At first, things were smooth. The neighbors waved politely, and although I got a stack of newsletters and notices from the HOA in my mailbox every other day, most of them were about neighborhood picnics or recycling reminders. But then, a month after I moved in, I noticed something odd in my utility bills. I had always been precise about tracking expenses. I knew what I used, down to the last kilowatt hour. So when I opened the envelope and saw my electric bill had jumped by nearly $5,000, my jaw literally dropped. I reread the paper thinking maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone else's bill had been accidentally placed in my account. But no, the address, the account number, my name, everything matched. The only thing that didn't make sense was the number. $5,000 for 1 month of electricity. I called the electric company immediately. After fighting through the automated menu and waiting on hold for 30 minutes, I finally reached a representative. "Yes, sir," the woman said, scanning through the account. "I see here that your usage spiked dramatically in the past month." "Spiked?" "By $5,000. That's impossible. I live alone. I work 9 hours a day. My lights are off half the time." "What do you mean spiked?" "Well," she hesitated, "it appears your home was rerouted as part of a community-wide billing adjustment. Do you live in a neighborhood with an HOA?" That word sent a chill through me. "Yes," I said slowly. "According to our system," she continued, "your account is now tied into what looks like a group meter. The HOA requested a redistribution of charges across all members' bills." I felt the blood rush to my head. "Are you telling me my HOA increased my bill by $5,000? Without my permission?" "I can't speak to the specifics," she said carefully, "but the adjustment request came from your homeowners association. You'd need to take this up with them directly." I hung up furious. That night I went through every single appliance in my house just to be sure. My fridge, my lights, my washer and dryer, they all worked fine and nothing indicated unusual consumption. I checked my neighbors' houses from the street. Lights blazing, pool pumps running, decorative yard lights twinkling. And suddenly it clicked. The HOA had redistributed their communal power costs, pool maintenance, clubhouse lights, street lamps, and who knows what else, onto me. Me, the newest homeowner, the one least likely to notice or fight back. The next morning I stormed into the HOA office. It was a bland little building attached to the community clubhouse, with beige walls and a receptionist who looked like she hated her job. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I snapped. "But unless you want me to call the State Utilities Commission right now, you're going to get me someone in charge." She gave me a tight-lipped smile and disappeared into the back. A few minutes later, a man walked out. He was in his 50s with slicked-back gray hair, a cheap suit, and a smirk plastered on his face that screamed arrogance. "Mr. Daniels," he said, extending his hand as though we were old friends. "I'm Richard, president of the HOA. What seems to be the problem?" I ignored his hand. "The problem," I said, holding up my bill, "is that you had the electric company tack on $5,000 to my account." "Care to explain?" He glanced at the bill, barely fazed. "Ah yes, the new energy redistribution plan. All homeowners agreed to share costs for communal facilities. It's in the bylaws." "I didn't agree to anything," I shot back. "Well, the board voted," he said with a shrug. "And as a member of this community, you're bound by our decisions." I could feel my hands clench into fists. "So you just dumped the entire neighborhood's bill on me?" "Not the entire bill," he said smoothly. "Just a fair share. Some people here are elderly, retired, or struggling financially. We like to balance things. And frankly, Mr. Daniels, you're new, you're employed, and from what we see, you can afford it. I stared at him in disbelief. You can't do this. This is theft. Richard leaned back slightly, smugness radiating off him. You could take it up with a lawyer, of course. But while you do, penalties and interest will accrue, and we can put a lien on your home if necessary. That was the moment I realized what I was dealing with. These people weren't just running a neighborhood. They were running a racket. And I wasn't about to roll over. I walked out without another word, my mind already racing. That night, as I sat in my darkened living room, because no way in hell was I going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me run up more charges, I began to plan. The HOA wanted to play games with power? Fine. They thought they controlled the switch. They didn't know who they were messing with. I worked in facilities management before I'd moved here. I knew how systems worked, how power grids were structured, where main lines were buried. If anyone could figure out how to turn the lights out on these parasites, it was me. I started with research. Blueprints, permits, community planning documents, most of which were accessible through county records. I traced the layout of the neighborhood, noting where the power lines fed into the HOA's clubhouse, the pool, the decorative streetlights. The entire communal system was hooked into a single main line that branched out before reaching individual homes. If someone were to cut power at the right junction, the entire HOA-owned property would go dark. Houses would still have electricity, but everything else, the clubhouse, pool, and streetlights, would shut down. It was almost poetic. For the next week, I quietly gathered supplies. Heavy-duty bolt cutters, insulated gloves, a padlock. I walked the neighborhood at odd hours, taking jogs that were really reconnaissance missions, noting the maintenance panels and junction boxes. Nobody paid attention. They all thought I was just the new guy trying to get some exercise. But inside, my rage was simmering hotter with each passing day. Every smug smile from Richard, every HOA notice stuffed into my mailbox, every extra cent they squeezed out of me, it all added fuel to the fire. Finally, one night around midnight, I made my move. The streets were silent. The air was heavy. The kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I walked casually toward the junction box near the clubhouse, carrying a gym bag that concealed my tools. My pulse quickened as I reached it. I crouched down, cut the cheap lock with one clean snap, and swung the metal door open. Inside, wires and switches hummed softly, feeding life into the HOA's precious clubhouse and its sparkling pool. "Let's see how you like paying the price," I muttered. I pulled the lever. The effect was instant. The clubhouse went dark. The pool lights flickered out, leaving the water a black pit. Street lamps winked off one by one until the whole block was swallowed by shadows. For a moment, silence reigned. Then came the voices, shouts, confusion. Car alarms chirped as people hit buttons on their key fobs, trying to make sense of what was happening. Somewhere, a dog barked frantically, and then I heard the best sound of all, Richard's voice shouting from his porch. What the hell is going on? I smiled to myself, locking the junction box with my own padlock before slipping into the night. They had taken $5,000 from me. Now I had taken their precious power, and this was only the beginning. The blackout didn't feel like a victory at first. It felt like the quiet before something larger, like the moment a storm takes a breath before it tears through the trees. I watched from the shadows as people stumbled into the street, phone screens casting pale rectangles of light on anxious faces. Cars idled with hazard lights blinking. Neighbors banged on doors, and the HOA's little empire that had always felt so immovable now looked small and vulnerable in the dark. Within 10 minutes, I heard the scrape of a pickup truck, the HOA's maintenance crew, or at least the people who pretended to be. Someone shouted. Flashlights bobbed. I ducked back behind a hedgerow and watched them swarm the clubhouse like ants around a disrupted mound. They fumbled with the same junction box I'd left, cursed when they found the lock different, and muttered into radios with the kind of clipped panic I'd only ever seen on security footage. Richard appeared like a meteor from his porch. "Collar up!" Slippers slapped against concrete as he marched toward the cluster. His face was pale in the dim glow of a neighbor's phone screen. I could hear him yelling, the cadence frantic, trying to regain control. For the first time, his smooth veneer cracked. "It's sabotage," he barked. "Someone cut our power. Call the police. Call the electric company." This is a criminal act. The electric company did show up, a truck with amber lights, the kind that makes every neighborhood emergency look official. The technician knelt by the box, shook his head, and said things like illegal tampering and criminal case. The HOA board kept insisting they'd file reports. They mentioned insurance and liability as if the words were spells that would fix everything. A week passed and the bills kept coming. My own account remained unchanged. My meter spun like it always had, indifferent. The HOA, on the other hand, hammered out a response plan with the kind of efficiency that said they were more used to voting on paint colors than facing a real fight. They installed new locks, hired an overnight security guard, and held emergency meetings that smelled faintly of cheap coffee and legalese. Notices were nailed to bulletin boards and slipped under doormats. We will prosecute, we will not tolerate vandalism. We will recover costs. They thought the narrative would stick. Lawless newcomer trips, HOA defends community. I knew better. I had to be pragmatic, not theatrical. Sabotage had been a message, not the endgame. Now they would double down. Predictability was their weakness. I started watching them more closely, learning the rhythm of their defenses. The new security guard was all shoulders and club, glowering at joggers and checking IDs like a bouncer. Cameras sprouted on lampposts, ugly black eyes that tracked movement on the sidewalks. The board's meetings turned into rehearsed monologues about community standards. I couldn't simply sit and wait for them to find me. I began to poke at the edges of their new fortress. First came small surgical acts of annoyance that wouldn't peg me as reckless, but would test their patience and resources. I neutralized the padlock on a storage shed that held the HOA's decorative holiday lights, slipping the lock off so it would be found open at dawn. I rerouted the clubhouse's smart thermostat, so the heating system squeezed itself into a chaotic, noisy cycle of extreme highs and lows. I left anonymous notes inside the laundry room. Check the meter and you overcharge. Little things that forced them to spend money and attention and made residents murmur. The murmurs had weight. People began to question the board, quietly at first, then more openly. The HOA's first proper retaliatory move was the thing I had expected. They targeted me where it hurt most: reputation and legal footing. A notice arrived at my door, thick and papered with faux concern. They had found discrepancies in my account, alleged unauthorized work, and for the good of the community they were imposing a special assessment to cover restoration costs. The fine was steep. The language was intentionally opaque, designed to sound reasonable while functioning as a financial chokehold. They added charges to my account for increased communal security and billed me for repairs to the junction box I had tampered with. The electric company sent a terse letter saying my meter had been inspected and flagged for investigation. Richard wrote me an email which managed to be both conciliatory and predatory. We'd prefer to resolve this amicably, but we must protect the interests of the community. I understood the chessboard now. They were forcing me into a corner where the only options seemed to be paying up, hiring counsel, or moving out. All three were exactly what they wanted, but I still had things they didn't: time, knowledge, and the ability to stay invisible inside the creases of the night. So I went to work on two fronts: public perception and operational exposure. Public perception required subtler hands. I started leaving flyers under windshield wipers in the early hours. Short, direct, not libelous, but pointed. Ask your board where your money goes. Why did HOA approve redistribution without homeowner consent? The messages were tame enough to be dismissed by the paranoid, but they were seeds. At the next homeowners meeting, people were already talking, and for the first time, a handful of neighbors raised their hands with complaints about new charges, poor transparency, and Richard's heavy-handedness. Operational exposure was darker and riskier. I needed to show that their alleged communal costs were a shell game, that the HOA's control over utilities was less about sharing fair responsibility and more about siphoning money and power to a small cabal who treated the neighborhood like their private cash machine. I dug through county records, filed public records requests for the HOA's meeting minutes, and spent an obscene amount of time in the municipal archives at dawn, scouring through PDF after PDF. I pulled together contracts with third-party vendors, traced where the HOA's money flowed, and mapped links between Richard and the local electrician who had conveniently recommended the redistribution plan. It didn't take long to find the nepotism and the sloppiness. The community maintenance vendor was a paper company owned by a friend of a board member. The so-called energy consultant who signed the redistribution request had ties to Richard through a local landscaping outfit. There were invoices with fuzzy line items and a pattern of recurring fees that ballooned whenever the board convened in private. Solid evidence was one thing. Making it hurt was another. I compiled everything into a dossier, printed it on a cheap home printer, and began slipping copies into mail slots, tucking them into grocery bags in the parking lot, and handing them to neighbors at the mailbox. The effect was quicksilver. Where there had been polite smiles, there were now whispers. Where there had been deference, there were pointed questions. A woman I'd barely spoken to before, Maria, who lived 2 houses down, cornered me with trembling fingers and said, "I never knew. Why didn't anyone tell us?" They still tried to deflect. Richard launched a smear campaign by proxy, planting rumors that I had a history of unpaid debts, that I'd been evicted from a previous place. His allies circulated an anonymous letter alleging I'd tampered with other personal property. When the letters reached me, they were impersonal and cruel, the work of someone who thought they could drown me in petty mud. But the more they flailed, the worse they looked. People detested bullies, and the HOA's bullying had mutated into a spectacle. The local newspaper, one I tipped off anonymously, ran a human interest piece about rising HOA fees and the opaque workings of homeowners boards. A reporter called Richard for comment. His face, when it appeared in the printed photo, looked like someone who had been caught mid-lie. The story did what my flyers and meetings couldn't do alone. It invited public scrutiny, and public scrutiny had teeth. Now that the optics were shifting, the HOA shifted gears. They began with a threat of legal action, and then, when that didn't terrify everyone into silence, they flexed their bureaucratic muscles. They filed a lien against my property, claiming unpaid assessments tied to the blackout and the costs of restoration. They sent letters alleging I'd breached community covenants. The language was cold and precise. It was meant to intimidate, to force me to spend money on attorney fees and to sap my resolve. They thought they had leverage. What they didn't realize was how valuable a cornered person's resourcefulness can be. I started to document everything obsessively. Every interaction, every letter, every bill, every misstatement made by the board. I recorded my conversations where legally permissible, copied emails, and cataloged discrepancies. I found a pro bono legal clinic at the university where law students took on HOA cases for experience. The students were brilliant in their hunger and eager to slice into procedural errors. The clinic helped me draft a response to the lien and initiated a motion to compel the HOA to produce financial records. Suddenly, the stage was legal as well as public. While the legal machinery turned, I continued to apply pressure operationally. The HOA's security cameras were a new annoyance, but they were predictable. I used those patterns to my advantage. When they scheduled maintenance, backups for the pumps, day-long servicing of the clubhouse systems, I timed my moves to coincide with distractions. I sent anonymous tips to the electric company with timestamps and photos of questionable billing practices. I flagged the vendor contracts that looked like nepotism on public forums and in neighborhood groups. Each nudge forced the HOA to respond, to spend money, and to reveal more of their structure. Retaliation escalated. One night my mailbox was vandalized, ripped open and strewn across the lawn. A childish act, but one saturated with menace. A window at my workshop was smashed. Someone slashed the tires of the car I usually worked on late at night. The threats had teeth now. Anonymous messages started appearing on my doorstep. "We know what you did. Pay up or else." I could have gone to the police after the broken window and the slashed tires. I did. The officer took a report and suggested I be careful, but law enforcement moves at the pace of bureaucracy, and by then the HOA had lawyers and money. The police were sympathetic but practical. They recommended documenting everything and pressing charges if there was clear evidence. The broken window was for now just one more ripple. With the stakes rising, I knew I had to be smarter. Brute force would get me arrested or worse, so I doubled down on the legal exposure. The motion to compel production was granted. The HOA's financial records were messy. Invoices without bids, payments made to shell companies, and duplicate charges that made my blood run cold. The students and a senior supervising attorney put together a FOIA request that dug deeper, exposing bid processes that had been circumvented and emails that implied a quid pro quo between board members and vendors. When we filed the petition to the county court, the judge looked at the HOA's documentation and asked hard questions. Richard sat in the courtroom with his jaw clenched, trying to act patient and indignant, the way a man acts when he thinks his position is absolute. He didn't look so strong in front of a judge. There is something humbling about the silence of a courtroom when evidence is presented that corrodes a lie. On paper, my case began to solidify. The court ordered an independent audit of the HOA's accounts. The audit found inefficiencies and questionable disbursements, not enough to prove criminality outright, but enough to show negligence and poor governance. The court placed temporary restraints on some of the board's more aggressive collection practices and barred them from levying new assessments until the audit concluded. You would think that tempered their aggression. Instead, it made them dirtier in other ways. Board members started whispering in clusters, trying to cultivate friendly neighbors into allies, promising reduced fees and better amenities if they supported the board. A smear campaign on social media painted me as a disruptive outsider, a saboteur with no respect for community harmony. The comment sections became battlegrounds. Neighbors I'd once waved at now treated me like an inconvenient storm. Still, the tide had turned. People were no longer reflexively siding with the HOA. They were asking questions. That alone was dangerous for Richard and his inner circle. It was like stripping paint from an old fence. Once the first layer is gone, the rot underneath becomes visible. Through it all, I kept my focus, expose the corruption, protect my home, and make it costly enough that the HOA either reformed or collapsed under the weight of its own greed. I'd started this war because they took $5,000 from me and thought I would pay without asking why. Somewhere along the line, that small personal fight became something bigger, a fight for the neighborhood itself. And as the audit began and lawyers scribbled notes and neighbors stopped instinctively deferring to the board, I realized the blackout was only the opening gambit. The real battle would be won with evidence, patience, and the slow erosion of an empire built on the complacency of others. You. The audit was like blood in the water, and the sharks began circling fast. Neighbors who had once nodded politely but stayed out of HOA affairs suddenly had opinions, questions, and demands. For years they had tolerated Richard and his little empire because it was easier to stay silent than to fight. But now, with numbers printed on official paper and a judge acknowledging something was wrong, silence no longer protected them. It made them complicit. At first, the board tried to dismiss the audit as routine, something blown out of proportion by outsiders who didn't understand the complexities of community management. They sent out glossy flyers filled with buzzwords: sustainability, shared responsibility, fairness. But the words rang hollow, especially when people compared them to the actual figures. Residents saw invoices for landscaping services that cost 3 times the going rate. They saw energy bills inflated with consulting fees. They saw repairs that had never happened but were charged anyway. The murmurs spread into arguments at the mailbox, at the poolside, on sidewalks. I walked through the neighborhood and heard fragments of conversations. Did you see the line item for the clubhouse furniture? $30,000. For what, folding chairs? They said it was a vendor contract. Vendor my ass, it's Richard's cousin. They've been bleeding us dry. And for what? To light up a pool half the neighborhood doesn't even use? The anger grew, and for the first time since I'd moved in, I felt like maybe I wasn't fighting alone. But Richard wasn't going down quietly. He was too entrenched, too arrogant. He doubled down on his smear campaign against me. Anonymous letters appeared in mailboxes accusing me of being the one who had destabilized the community. He went on the neighborhood Facebook group and posted long, self-righteous rants about malicious actors sowing division. He never mentioned me by name, but it was clear who the villain of his story was. The irony was almost comical. He had stolen thousands from me, and when I exposed it, suddenly I was the problem. But that was Richard's gift. He could twist any narrative, wrap it in enough sanctimonious words that people who weren't paying close attention might actually believe him. I couldn't let him control the story. So I did something that felt uncomfortable at first. I went public, not anonymously, not through whispers or flyers, but openly. I attended the next HOA meeting in the clubhouse, which was still half-powered thanks to temporary generators, and I sat right in the front row. The room was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen before. The audit had pulled people out of their complacency and they wanted answers. Richard sat at the long table in front with his board members, his suit freshly pressed, his smirk rehearsed. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, but the tension was thick. Then Richard launched into his spiel. "Yes, the audit raised some questions," he said smoothly. "But let me be clear. These numbers don't tell the whole story. Managing a community requires foresight, responsibility, and sometimes difficult decisions. What we've done for the benefit of all." He went on about collective welfare and long-term vision. But I could see the restless shifting in the crowd. People weren't buying it anymore. I stood up. My voice cut through the room. "Then explain why you signed off on contracts with companies owned by your friends. Explain why you funneled energy costs into homeowners' bills without a vote. Explain why we're paying inflated prices for services no one asked for." The room buzzed. People nodded. Richard's face twitched just slightly. "But enough. This is exactly the kind of disruption I was talking about," he said sharply. "You think you understand governance because you read a few documents. But you don't see the big picture. You don't understand the responsibilities." "No," I interrupted. "I understand theft. I understand corruption. And I understand when people in power think they can bully everyone else into silence." A cheer broke out. Not loud, but enough. Enough to tip the balance. For the rest of that meeting, Richard lost control. People bombarded him with questions. His answers grew more defensive, more strained. By the end, he was promising a comprehensive review and community input sessions. Words that sounded desperate even as he tried to make them authoritative. When I walked out of that meeting, neighbors I barely knew shook my hand. Some thanked me. A few whispered that they were scared Richard would retaliate. I told them what I'd already realized. Bullies only win when everyone else lets them. But Richard wasn't finished. That night my house was egged. The next morning someone had spray-painted "traitor" across my garage door in red. I cleaned it up, reported it, and refused to be intimidated. If anything, it confirmed I was getting to him. Then came the escalation I hadn't fully expected. Richard tried to drag me into court personally. The HOA filed a civil suit alleging malicious tampering with communal property, claiming the blackout had caused thousands in damages. They wanted me to pay restitution, legal fees, and penalties. It was a bold move, one that might have crushed someone else under the weight of court costs and paperwork. But I had the pro bono legal clinic backing me, and I had something Richard didn't: evidence. When the case hit the courtroom, their accusations crumbled quickly. They had no proof tying me directly to the blackout, and the audit's findings undercut their claims of damages. My lawyers countered with evidence of mismanagement, showing that the blackout hadn't caused financial losses so much as exposed them. The judge wasn't sympathetic to Richard's theatrics. He dismissed most of their claims outright and scheduled further hearings on the HOA's finances instead. It was a brutal blow to Richard's strategy, and I could see it in his face as he walked out of the courtroom, pale and tight-lipped. The fallout rippled fast. The board started fracturing. One member resigned for personal reasons, though everyone knew it was because they didn't want to be dragged deeper into Richard's mess. Another began leaking information to residents desperate to distance themselves. Richard fought harder, but the harder he fought, the more desperate he looked. At one point, he tried to frame me as a danger to the neighborhood, filing noise complaints and accusing me of suspicious behavior. The police came by once, checked everything, and left unimpressed. His credibility was eroding by the day. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was changing. Where once people had kept their heads down, they now spoke openly. Small groups gathered in driveways discussing alternatives, talking about recall elections. Someone even started a petition to dissolve the HOA altogether, citing corruption and mismanagement. I kept pushing. Every time Richard tried to paint me as a villain, I answered with facts, documents, and calm words. Every lie he told, I countered with the truth. Slowly, the balance of power shifted, and then came the night that broke him. It was late, around 2 a.m., when I woke to shouting outside. I pulled on a jacket and stepped out to see flashing lights. A police cruiser was parked outside the clubhouse, and officers were hauling boxes of files out the door. Richard stood on the curb, red-faced and shouting, but no one was listening. Word spread fast. The county had opened an investigation into financial fraud. The audit, the leaks, the documents, it had all added up. Richard wasn't just losing his grip on the neighborhood. He was staring down real consequences. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering, some cheering quietly. For the first time, the clubhouse wasn't a place of authority. It was a crime scene. I stood in the shadows, watching Richard's empire crumble piece by piece, and I felt a grim satisfaction. He had stolen from me, tried to ruin me, tried to silence me. Now he was the one exposed, the one cornered, the one powerless. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Men like Richard don't just vanish when the spotlight hits them. They claw, they scheme, they try to rise again from the wreckage. The HOA was wounded, bleeding, maybe dying. But the fight for real freedom, for me and for everyone in the neighborhood, wasn't finished, and I was ready for the final round. The night the police raided the clubhouse marked a turning point for the entire neighborhood. For months, Richard and his board had ruled with an iron grip, cloaked in bureaucracy and intimidation. But now, their fortress of bylaws and threats had been pierced by flashing lights and uniformed officers carrying out boxes of evidence. The illusion of control was gone. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive kicked open. People gathered in clusters, trading rumors, speculating on charges, laughing nervously at the absurdity of it all. For the first time since I'd moved here, there was no fear in their voices when they talked about the HOA. "Did you hear they seized his computer?" one neighbor whispered at the mailbox. "They say he was funneling money to his brother's company." Another added, "They should lock him up and throw away the key." I listened quietly, knowing that while gossip ran wild, the truth was even worse than most realized. The audit had shown incompetence. The investigation was about to show outright fraud. That afternoon, I received an official notice from the county clerk's office. I opened the envelope with shaking hands and found exactly what I'd hoped for. The court had frozen the HOA's authority to levy new fines, assessments, or liens until the investigation was complete. In other words, Richard's favorite weapon, financial punishment, was gone. He must have realized the walls were closing in, because the very next day he came to my house. I heard the knock and opened the door to find him standing there, no suit, no smirk. He looked smaller somehow, his hair unkempt, his face drawn with sleepless nights. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. "We need to talk," he said. I crossed my arms. "We don't need to do anything." His voice dropped low, almost pleading. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot. Mistakes were made. But if you keep pushing this, you're going to burn the whole neighborhood down. Property values will tank, insurance rates will skyrocket. Everyone loses." I stared at him, amazed at the audacity. Even at rock bottom, he was trying to reframe himself as the guardian of the community. "You already burned it down," I said flatly. "You just thought no one would notice until the ashes settled." His jaw clenched, and for a second I saw the old Richard flicker back. The arrogance, the entitlement. But then it faded into something I'd never seen before. Fear. He muttered something about lawyers and settlements before turning and walking away. Shoulders slumped. It was the last time he ever knocked on my door. Over the following weeks, the investigation picked apart every thread of the HOA's finances. What started as whispers about nepotism became full-blown revelations of embezzlement, fraudulent contracts, and misappropriated funds. It wasn't just a few bad invoices. It was a systemic siphoning of money from homeowners into Richard's pockets and the pockets of his allies. The board tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance, but the documents told a different story. Emails, signatures, and meeting minutes tied them all together. One by one, they resigned under pressure. By the end of the month, Richard was the last man standing, and then even he was gone, forced to step down after the county filed formal charges. The HOA was left leaderless, its power gutted. A temporary committee of homeowners was formed to manage basic operations, while the court decided whether the association should be dissolved entirely. For many, it was the first taste of self-governance they'd ever had in this neighborhood, and it was liberating. But for me, the victory wasn't just about Richard stepping down or the HOA collapsing. It was about reclaiming what they had stolen. Not just money, but dignity, peace of mind, the right to live without fear of arbitrary punishment. One evening, a few weeks after the raid, I sat in my backyard watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was quiet, broken only by the sound of kids playing in the street. Maria, the neighbor who had once nervously asked me about the flyers, walked over with a smile. "You know," she said, leaning on the fence, "if it weren't for you, none of this would have happened." We would have just kept paying and grumbling, and Richard would still be sitting in that clubhouse counting our money. I shrugged. I just wanted my $5,000 back, she laughed. You got us a lot more than that. You gave us our neighborhood back. Her words stuck with me. I hadn't set out to be a hero. I wasn't even sure I wanted that kind of recognition. I'd just been angry, stubborn, unwilling to let a bully win. But maybe that was enough. Maybe that's all it ever takes. One person refusing to roll over. The final blow came when the court ruled on restitution. Richard was ordered to repay hundreds of thousands to the HOA fund, money that would be redistributed to homeowners. I received a check in the mail, my $5,000 reimbursed plus damages for the fraudulent charges they'd attempted to impose. It wasn't about the money anymore, but I won't lie. Holding that check felt damn good. Not long after, the county announced that the HOA would be dissolved entirely. The neighborhood would transition to a simple civic association with no power to levy fines or dictate rules beyond basic maintenance. People celebrated in driveways, raised glasses of wine, lit up grills. It felt like Independence Day had come early. Richard, meanwhile, faced trial. I didn't attend, but I read every article. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of authority. He stood in a courtroom stripped of all his bluster. A man who had believed himself untouchable, now reduced to begging for leniency. The judge wasn't impressed. He was sentenced to several years in prison, his empire reduced to dust. I thought that would be the end of it, but the impact lingered. For months after, people would stop me on the street, thank me, tell me how different the neighborhood felt. Kids rode their bikes without fear of being scolded for noise. Families planted gardens without worrying about violations. The streets felt alive in a way they never had before. Sometimes, late at night, I'd walk past the clubhouse. It was shuttered now, dark and abandoned. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. To most, it was just an empty building. To me, it was a monument to arrogance, and to what happens when people finally push back. I remembered the night I cut their power, the way the neighborhood had plunged into darkness. At the time, it had felt like rebellion. Now, in hindsight, I realized it had been a preview, because Richard and his board had always thrived on keeping us in the dark. About money, about decisions, about their corruption. All I'd done was flip the switch. And once people saw the truth, once they felt the fear melt away, they had no interest in going back. In the end, that was the real victory. Not the check, not the dissolution of the HOA, not even Richard's downfall. The real victory was light, shining where it had never been allowed before. As I stood there in the quiet, watching the clubhouse rot in silence, I couldn't help but smile. Because for the first time since moving here, I finally felt at home. You.